And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers and moderator for this evening. Donna Brazile is former chair of the Democratic National Committee, adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University, the King Lecture Chair at Howard University, and a Fox News contributor. Aside from her beloved New Orleans, Donna's passion is encouraging young people to vote, to work within the system to strengthen it, and to run for public office. Over the past 20 years, Donna has lectured at over 125 colleges and universities on such topics as inspiring civility in American politics, race relations in the age of Obama, why diversity matters, and women in American politics. Donna has received honorary doctorate degrees from Louisiana State University, North Carolina A&T State University, and Xavier University of Louisiana, the only historically black Catholic institution of higher education in the United States. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Jason Reilly is a columnist and editorial board member for the Wall Street Journal, where he began his career in 1994. His popular weekly column, Upward Mobility, has run since 2016. Jason is also a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a Fox News commentator. Jason was the 2018 recipient of the prestigious Bradley Prize and is the author of several books, including his most recent, Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. A native of Buffalo, New York, Jason is a graduate of the State University of New York at Buffalo. We are also proud that Jason is a member of Steamboat Institute's Campus Liberty Tour Advisory Board. Welcome, Jason. And our moderator this evening is Patrice Onwuka. Patrice is a political commentator and director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum. She is also a senior fellow with the Philanthropy Roundtable and a Tony Blankley Fellow with the Steamboat Institute. Patrice is a frequent guest on Fox News, Fox Business, and PBS programs. She hosts a column called The New Agenda for Black Women on Newsmax and is a contributor to the Washington Examiner and The Hill. Born in the Caribbean, Patrice immigrated with her family to Boston, where she grew up. She is a graduate of Tufts University and earned her master's degree in international relations from Boston College. And now I will turn it over to our moderator, Patrice Onwuka.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer, and welcome everyone. So this conversation tonight is very timely, as I think everyone knows. It's been nearly 1 week since we've seen former police officer Derek Chauvin convicted of killing George Floyd. And I think it's fair to say that our nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. One that the city of Minneapolis and many other cities across the country, unfortunately, or fortunately, did not burn or, fell into, potentially violent riots. And meanwhile, though, against this backdrop, we continue to see a couple of different things going on here. We've got policing issues, street violence front and center. I mean, I'm sure many of you saw in your Facebook timelines the chilling video of police officers pulling the lifeless body of a 7-year-old out of the car her father was driving at McDonald's. It had been shot up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At the same time, we have police videos of Ma'Khia Bryant, who was shot while wielding a knife against another young woman, and of course 20-year-old Dante Wright killed in Minneapolis as well. But tonight's discussion is going to be broader than just policing, broader than just race and policing. I'm really trying to set a scene here. What I want us to talk about tonight, and I think it's an important discussion, about social justice in America. How are we living up to the ideal of equality and opportunity for all? And looking at today's social justice movement with fair eyes and open eyes. Is this movement moving us closer to greater equality for all Americans? I mean, I think it's pretty fair to say that this movement is very laser focused on police brutality against black men and women. But we also have senseless crime that goes on everywhere where police are not pulling the trigger. And beyond just policing, which we're not just going to focus on tonight, but beyond policing, there are so many other issues affecting the minority community. We've got rising crime, high unemployment, faltering home ownership rates, educational gaps, which were acutely came into focus because of the pandemic, and of course, health disparities. So, I think about the fact that minority children are potentially a year plus behind because of the pandemic. And many of these kids are kids who are already struggling in schools that were failing before. So tonight we're going to discuss the current social justice movement. How does it compare to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s? And importantly, I want us to move forward. What is it going to look like for us to ensure that every American, no matter what your race or your color or your ethnicity and your background is, has equal opportunity to achieve exactly what you want to in this life, in this country? So a couple of housekeeping items for everyone here. Number one, the layout for tonight. Donna and then Jason will each provide a few opening remarks. They'll kick off the discussion, and then I'll be asking them some questions where they'll be following up with each other. Then we will take plenty of questions from the audience, both the audience online as well as the audience in the room. So there are two ways for you to submit questions. If you're in the room, you'll see on your tables a paper with a QR code on it. You can scan that and submit your question that way. If you're online there are ways for you to submit questions. And then third housekeeping item, we are taking a poll. We want to understand how you feel, what your perception of the social justice movement of today is and how it compares to the civil rights movement. So use, again, the QR code in front of you if you're in the room today, or if you're online, you can go on to where you're watching. There should be a link for you to answer the poll question. And we want to see how this conversation maybe changes, or maybe it doesn't change your perception. So with that, I'm going to open the floor. Donna, please come and share some remarks with us.
Thank you so much. I'm Catholic, so if I get a chance to speak behind a podium, I take advantage of it. Now, my sermon is going to be very long tonight. I'm going to do like those Baptist preachers, Jason. I'm going to start low, go slow, rise high, strike fire, and then sit my ass down. But don't worry, Patrice. I'll make it as good as possible. It is so good to be out of Washington, D.C., even for 24 hours. And to be able to walk the streets without my mask on and smell all of this good mountain freshness. When I went home to Louisiana, we have 4 seasons: shrimp, crab, crawfish, and oysters. And unfortunately, I couldn't smell any of them. So I took my mask off and I started eating everything just to catch up on the last year. But thank you all. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Steamboat Institute and the Benson Center, the University of Colorado, for inviting me, and Jason. And I want to thank Jennifer in particular, because at the time she reached out to me, I had not been vaccinated. And a few weeks later, and I didn't even turn 65, I was vaccinated on Valentine's Day. That was my love. That was for me. I wanted to be vaccinated. And I got my second one on March 5th. So I'm fully vaccinated. And just to make sure, I try to have a shot of Jameson every night to ensure that it will work. That's my pre-existing condition. And so, my friends, America is divided. America is divided. That's a problem, not an excuse. Hyperpartisanship should never be an excuse when democracy is on the line. Our divisions must not be exploited for partisan gain. And let's be clear, this division, this hyperpartisanship, is eroding our trust in our country. It's eroding our trust in our own democracy and the public institutions that lay the foundation that we all know. Yet every day, misinformation, disinformation are being deployed to inflame the anger and fear of the most strident among us. So-called leaders inspire insurrection and subvert faith in our most sacred institutions, all to keep that anger at a boiling point. Meanwhile, the governing party is left to deal with the state of perpetual crisis, mass shooting, public killings by police officers, gang turf battles, domestic abuse, illegal crossings at the border, and so much more. A grievance politics of imagined slights and non-existent election fraud is purposefully stoked, while those with legitimate grievances about 400 years of oppression and violence are portrayed as agitators and criminals who might hate their country. Social justice movement began because the legitimate pain is too hard to bear. It's difficult to understand for those who have never experienced the pain of being the other, the one with the black or brown skin, with an accent, or with a questionable immigration status, or a different faith, religion, country of origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So the movements of those who are marginalized arise organically. They aren't stoked by fear-mongering politicians. They're like seeds that keeps on sprouting even when all of the barriers and obstacles to be overcome and the many more battles ahead. Yeah, they're seeds that keep on sprouting even when all of the barriers and obstacles to be overcome. They're still with us. Many of us continue to believe that we must claim our right of a citizenship in our country. A country that is supposed to be about all of us, regardless of what we look like. I once held my hand up saying that, yes, I'm black. Then I held it up again and I said, you know, I'm Irish. People looked at me. I'm black Irish. This is what it looks like. We must claim as Americans that we all believe that liberty and justice should be for all of us, every day, every year. We don't want anything special. James Brown once sang this song, and I loved it as a child, although I can't do the dances anymore, but he said, just open up the door. We'll get it ourselves, but just open the door and we will work as hard as anyone to get that citizenship and defend our democracy. Like my father did, like my grandfather, like my cousins, like my uncles. History has taught us that change does not happen overnight. So we know we have work to do, and we can only do it if we agree to talk with civility and with mutual respect. If our identity informs our politics, we can still live and work together with those who have different identities and different politics. Just as our own striving should not be dismissed as wokeness or cancel culture, so we need to respect and accept the legitimacy of contrary voices. Racism has poisoned so much of our American life. It has poisoned dialogue. It plagues us. It's not enough to be an anti-racist. We must be pro-justice, pro-equality, and we must believe that liberty and justice is for everyone, no exceptions. Lastly, see, I told you I was going to end before midnight. Until you see me and anyone else who is different from you, until you see me for who I am, because I am speaking as someone who knows who she is. I have decided what I like to be called. I know that I am a fifth-generation American, and I'm proud that I can trace my family roots back. I'm proud of the progress. I've seen so much in my years as an American citizen. I'm so proud that we have come this far, but we have further to go, but we cannot get there if we go at it alone. We must go together. We must go as one people. We must go believing that we can achieve what Dr. King saw that day, that hot day in August. He saw that day. He believed in that moment. He believed in that hour. And yet it is up to us to fulfill his dream. Every American deserves to make good on the promises of hope and achieve real access to the circle of opportunity. No American should be cast out and live on the outskirts of hope. Everyone should be brought into the circle of opportunity. That's what liberty and justice for all means. Faith in the belief that one day we shall overcome. With that, I'll give back the balance of all of that extra time to Jason. Because only a good woman would turn over the mic to a man. God bless you.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. Okay. I also want to thank the Benson Center. Excuse me. I also want to thank the Benson Center and the Steamboat Institute for having me today and for that introduction. And thank all of you for taking some time out to be here this evening for this discussion. I thought I'd just spend a few minutes giving a very quick answer to the question that Patrice put to you and to the people watching online about how the social justice movement today compares with the movement of the past. Donna invoked Dr. King, and I thought I'd do the same through a personal anecdote. So a few years ago, I wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal on the prevalence of violent crime in poor black neighborhoods. And in the column, I used a quote from Dr. King, who once said to a black congregation, quote, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population in St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes?" King said, "We've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know that there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves." Now, after the column ran, a number of readers contacted the paper and accused me of making up the quote, which comes from a 1961 profile of King written by the famous black author James Baldwin in Harper's Magazine in 1961. Now, I was a little surprised by this reaction because all you have to do these days is Google a quote to find the source. But what really struck me about what the accusers are saying is that apparently they just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems in the black community and the role of personal responsibility. Now, King was obviously a uniquely gifted and capable leader, and I'm not suggesting that black people today need another Dr. King. They don't. What I'm suggesting is that King represented a type of leadership, a type of thinking, a good faith approach to closing racial divisions that politicians and social activists today barely even pay lip service to. King and his generation of leaders believed that whites obviously had a role to play in changing a fundamentally racist system. But they also understood that blacks had a role to play. And they were willing to hold blacks accountable, despite the white racism, the legal and rampant white racism that existed at the time. They asked something of black people. They operated under the belief and tried to instill in young people the belief that blacks must succeed notwithstanding these racial barriers, that blacks can't sit around waiting for whites to get their act together first. By contrast, many activists and politicians today who express concern about the plight of the black underclass ask almost nothing of black people. They spend much more time making excuses for the kind of antisocial behavior that prominent black leaders of the King era would regularly condemn. Young black kids are sent out in the world today with a chip on their shoulders. They're told the cops are gunning for them, that their teachers are racist, that the tests in school are racist, the employers are racist, the judges and the prosecutors are racist. The entire justice system is stacked against them, is what they're told. They're told that the world owes them, and that if they don't succeed, it's not their fault. So at a time when young blacks today are far more likely to experience racial preferences than racial prejudice, at a time when you have a generation of blacks who came of age with a twice-elected black president, we have people in positions of influence and authority insisting that blacks can't be held in any way responsible for these persistent racial gaps until white racism has been essentially vanquished from America. In many cases, you're dealing with black leaders and activists who consider any focus on black responsibility and accountability to be itself a form of racism. And the academic and political and media establishment, for the most part, play right along with this narrative. The critical race theorists, the social activists today, ask almost nothing of blacks. They argue that all black problems were caused by whites and are the responsibility of whites to solve. The activists today, I think, have forgotten what the King generation understood all too well, that the problems of blacks today extend far beyond the moral failings of white people. And that's not a topic we spend enough time talking about, though. I hope we will this evening. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both for your comments. I'm looking forward to a nice, passionate, and civil discussion tonight. So, Donna, I'm going to pose the first question to you. I think Jason touched on this a little bit, but we have seen, civil rights leaders like John Lewis embrace Black Lives Matter and the social justice movement in general. But, for example, Robert Woodson, for example, reject it. He was also part of the civil rights era. How do you contrast BLM and the overall social justice movement with what we have seen in the past from the civil rights era? I think we heard from Jason, but I'd love to hear your response.
It's two different generations, two different eras. I mean, I grew up, I would say, at the height of the civil rights movement. I respected the leadership that came as a result of that movement. Many of them came from the black church, and Christianity formed much of the language and the spirit of that movement, nonviolence. Basically, it was more of what would Jesus do? It was a generation that spoke in universal language. Civil rights, after all, was not simply about bringing blacks into the system. It was eliminating barriers faced by everyone. The other part of that movement came from the leadership of the traditional historical civil rights organizations, many of them born in the period following slavery, a period that they wished to put the past behind so that the present could be the subject of the day. Now, that generation faced violent protests, death. That generation faced bombing of churches, hanging, lynching. And nevertheless, they kept on marching. They kept on believing that through their work, through confronting the system, they could achieve the goals that they sought by eliminating Jim Crow, which was legal segregation, apartheid, however you wish to describe it, and fulfilling the other part of that American dream, opening up doors, home ownership, creating a sustainable environment. That is the generation that I came out of. Today's generation is one that believes in the fierce urgency of now. Their leadership is not church-based or church-centered. These are organic activists that many of us don't know their names until we see them before a camera, if we get to see them. They don't have the structures of the civil rights organizations, the chapters, although they are being developed and they're being built. But this generation believed after the election in 2008 of Barack Obama that things would change. Things would change not just in their lives. They're not asking anybody, to leave the room. They're asking people to scoot over and make room for others. And yet they believe that this country is not moving fast enough and quick enough. Now, I want to address something. Because there's often this stereotype that somehow or another poor black people and others are to blame for their misfortunes. That's simply not true. Nor are poor white people to blame for their misfortunes. Remember this theory, the outskirts of hope. When you are not involved in the day-to-day of making decisions that impact your lives, of being involved in the policy making, in the decision making, your communities are left out. Your voices are diluted. You're marginalized. We have crime, just like we had a crack cocaine problem that we treated as a criminal justice issue. I know I'm diverting. But we have an opioid crisis that we treat as a health problem. We have millions of kids who can't find jobs. When you come to get a tax credit to build a stadium, and you come to get resources to put a stadium or arena, but yet when you want to put good schools and jobs, they're not there. My parents both had to catch a bus to get to work. So they relied on public transportation to get there. They didn't have a car. In fact, I didn't have a car until I was 34. Some people think they should take my keys now. I don't blame them. I'm still so excited to have a car, I just zoom. Okay? Me and Uber are now good friends, and Lyft too. I need a Lyft every day. But the point I'm making is that we have not structured a society where everyone has access to the quality of life and the tools that they need in order to succeed. The good news is that we can still get there, just like I got there, just like so many others have gotten there. And how do you get there? You get there, I agree with Jason, you get there with a good education. In fact, when I was a little girl growing up in the segregated Deep South, I thought my middle name was education, 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 education. My parents, my maid mother, and my janitor father put 8 out of 9 of us through college. 8 out of 9 children. And by the time I graduated from LSU after 4 years, I was making more money than my daddy, who had been working all of his life. I'll never forget, I went home after graduating. My mother wanted a bedspread, and I thought my daddy would like a good case of beer. So I went out and got him a big old suitcase of Heineken. He told me, girl, bring that back and get me some old Milwaukee Best. And in fact, you can get 2. But I was so proud that my parents, that they were capable through hard work to make it, to give me that opportunity. And that's why I believe we should pay it forward. That young black kid who's killing another young black kid, we need to save him or her. That troubled youth that's on drugs and can't get off whatever he or she is addicted to, we need to save them. They're worth saving. All our children are worth saving. But not all our children get the same opportunities. If all you see every day is the bleakness of despair and you don't see hope rising, then what future do you have? What chance will you have when you walk out of your house to succeed? It took a hell of a lot of courage for me to get up every day and walk out of my house. And it still takes a lot of courage for me to get out of my house. But the point I'm making is that if we can complain about all of the resources and all of the crime and all of the deprivation. But if we don't put positive forces forward and to give this generation an opportunity to soar, then they will struggle with life issues. I want to give them a chance, just like my generation had a chance. They deserve a chance to succeed. And with that, I'd stop talking because I know I talk too much. I tell you I'm Catholic. I like to talk. That's why they should have given women a little chapter in the Bible. Maybe I would shut up if Mary had her chapter, along with Mark and John and Luke.
And everyone else.
And Matthew.
So Jason, I think Donna makes some really compelling points about the differences, disparities that Black children, minority children have faced and face in the past and currently do. And just to remind everyone, the Black community, Hispanic community, Asian community is not a monolith. They are not all the same experiences. Not every Black person grew up in poverty. Not every Black person grew up in the hood. Not every Black person went to a public school. Many went to private schools. They have very different. So we have to be careful about painting with a broad brush. But focusing on those who have not been able to overcome some significant hurdles. I think this debate probably stems back to W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington, and how do you elevate the plight of Blacks? And you talk about personal responsibility, self-reliance, and I think, Donna, you're touching on kind of systemic changes. When we look at the social justice movement of today, I hear very much about equity versus equality. And I think that's a really important distinction to make and for us to understand they're not synonymous. Equity and equality do not mean the same thing, and the strategies are different. So can you break down the difference between the two? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we're starting to see equity play out.
Well, I think there's a lot of conflation of issues going on here. I mean, you brought up the Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois debate, which there are some ways that conversation is still taking place today. But both of those men were seeking fundamental rights for Blacks. That battle has been fought and won a long time ago. The problem with the social justice activists today is that the civil rights battles were fought and won in the 50s and 60s. And the problems that Blacks face today are not civil rights problems in the sense that they were civil rights problems in the 50s and 60s, the right to vote, for instance, or segregation, legal segregation. And so those are not today's problems for Black people. So that's one way I think things are being conflated. Bullets coming through walls at birthday parties in Black neighborhoods are not from the Ku Klux Klan driving around those neighborhoods shooting them up. There were 492 homicides in Chicago in 2019. 3 of the 492 involved police. 3. That is not a police brutality problem they have in Chicago. It's not a policing problem they have in Chicago, which is not to say we can't do more to make policing better and more effective. But the idea that we are having a national conversation about policing when 3 out of 492 homicides involve police is a little off the mark. These are not civil rights problems. This voting debate in Georgia recently, do you know that Black voter registration in Georgia is higher than white voter registration in Georgia? Do you know that Black voter turnout in Georgia is higher than white voter turnout in Georgia? Do you know that Black voter registration in general is higher in the South than it is in other parts of this country? Do you know why? Because we passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and it worked. In 1964, Black voter registration in Mississippi was about 6%. 2 years later, by 1966, just 1 year after the Voting Rights Act passed, it had climbed to 60%. The civil rights battles have been fought and won by the right side, as far as I'm concerned. The idea that we are trying to shoehorn today's problems into that model is where I'm in fundamental disagreement with the social justice activists today. I'll stop there.
Just a reminder to the audience, we have a poll question, and we want you to submit your questions. We're going to be taking them shortly, so please be submitting them. You've got your QR code, or you have a link online. Donna, you shook your head pretty strongly there in response to some of the things Jason said, so I'll give you a moment to respond.
I think there was a natural bridge from the civil rights struggles of the past 50 years and what I call the transition to economic empowerment, giving people the opportunity to open up and create small businesses, et cetera, which is an engine of how we create wealth and home ownership and the like. We still have issues of civil rights in insurance, issues of civil rights in banking, issues of civil rights in so many other areas that I hope that we can continue to make progress on. After all, if we make progress, it's good for the country, it's good for America. It's not just good for the black race, it's good for every American.
But this is a good
to
example,
create
Donna.
opportunity and to create wealth. Go ahead, brother.
But this is a good example of suggesting something as a civil rights problem because of a racial disparity that exists today, when there are many other explanations for why this disparity could exist that have nothing to do with racism or discrimination, let alone civil rights. So you mentioned banking.
Yes, I did.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming you're talking about the fact that blacks are turned down for loans at higher rates than whites.
Or they are charged more for
Right,
loans.
or steer towards subprime loans
Yes, correct.
at higher rates than whites.
That's one aspect of
Now,
banking.
do you know that Asians receive loans from banks at higher rates than whites? In other words, whites are turned down by banks at higher rates than Asians are.
And we should
Whites
address that too.
Whites are steered toward subprime mortgages at higher rates than Asians are. Now, to accept your supposition that this is a civil rights problem, we would have to assume that white-owned banks are discriminating against white people.
Well, whoever said civil rights was just a black issue, civil rights is an American issue.
Let me finish my point here.
'Cause it's
my
part of
point is
human
this isn't a
rights.
civil
Okay.
rights issue. Obviously, something else is going on to explain these disparities because white-owned banks are not discriminating against white people. The problem are the qualifications for the loans. All people are not equally qualified for all loans. And that is borne out in how the loans are given.
And how
And so...
okay. And how it's structured, Jason.
But
How loans are structured.
This is just one example of many where when you introduce another group, such as Asians, it very much complicates calling these civil rights issues. You could take schooling. There's a complaint that say black boys are suspended from school at higher rates than whites.
True.
Whites are suspended at higher rates than Asians. Well,
Jason, let's let Donna respond.
My point is this is an example of claiming something is a civil rights issue when there are other explanations for what is going on.
Maybe they are, but race has
More
been a
plausible
construct in American society. And unless you remove that construct, unless you remove it not only the legality of race, but the way in which race has been a part of the social construct. When you remove that when you remove it and you have those constructs removed, then everyone is treated equally, not just whites, Asians. Civil rights is an American issue. It's not just a black issue. When we fight for civil rights and equality, we're not just fighting for one group, we're fighting for everybody to have the same rights and the same opportunities as everyone else. But what I was trying to get to, because I was going off this notion of W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, I keep thinking about, if you look at that whole period of life, and W.B. Du Bois referred to the talented 10, but that transition that Dr. King and that generation, and we say Dr. King, but there are so many others, Roy Wilkins, Thurgood Marshall, because they had a multi-tier strategy and approach of dealing with segregation, of dealing with the inequality in the law, and making sure that we could remove all barriers, not just to blacks, but later in the women's movement, we removed barriers so that women could get credit cards, that women would not be able to get fired because they were pregnant. Sexual harassment and came under that rubric of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Section 7. So it's not just limited to blacks when we're saying civil rights. It is about freedom and equality for all people, all Americans. That's it.
Well, what else is being conflated here is the assumption that unequal outcomes is evidence of discrimination. And again, we can't automatically make that assumption. The other thing we often don't talk about is when blacks behave the same way that whites do towards blacks. You can say that white cab drivers are discriminating against blacks trying to hail a cab, but you have to acknowledge that black cab drivers also avoid picking up young black men.
Of course, I've seen it myself.
So is not picking up young black men always and everywhere evidence of racism? Or is there something else that might explain this behavior? And that's what I mean about grouping this all in as about civil rights or discrimination or racism. There are often and increasingly other explanations for why we see these disparities. And those other explanations are too seldom explored.
You don't have to tell me as a black woman, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you as a black man, what racism looks like and feels like in America in the 21st century. But I can say this, I can say that if we're going to move beyond the conversations that we've had for the last 400 years, then we're going to have to deal with the present day realities. And yes, those realities may be the crime that we're talking about and some of the other problems, but we have to still deal with systems and institutions that continue to leave certain people behind.
So picking up on that point.
I mean, when we put money into certain areas, we call it an investment. And there's no outcry because we're investing in jobs, we're investing in a community. But when we see money spent in other ways, that's being thrown away because those people will never, ever accept it. I mean, we need to understand the language that we're still using is in itself insulting. And if we're going to have a 21st century Voting Rights Act, which we should have, it should not discriminate based on where you live. Polling stations should not be closed in areas where people live. Every American should have equal access to the ballot. There should not be 2, 3, 4-hour wait in some neighborhoods and no wait in others.
Donna, black voter turnout in 2008 and 2012 exceeded white voter turnout in America.
As a proportion of the population. And black women, 75% of black women are registered to vote. I know because I've done a lot of work in that arena.
If the black vote
I've done a lot of work in that arena, Jason.
Where is the evidence?
The evidence is in when you see, and there was a bipartisan study that President Barack Obama commissioned, and Ben Ginsburg and Bob Barr talked about how faulty voting machines are put in certain areas and other areas get better voting machines. When you talk about the progress we've made from 300 black officials to over 10,000 today, that was a movement, a civil rights movement, and a justice movement that went out and registered people to vote. So we're proud of that. But just because they're voting in record numbers doesn't mean that their polling site should be 10 miles from their house.
Not just record numbers, at higher percentages of the people who are supposedly oppressing their vote.
And why you think that number is today in Georgia? Because Stacey Abrams in 2014 made it her focus to raise money and to remove barriers and to get people registered. But I'm saying, Jason, is that we could do it. No American should be denied the right to vote. No American.
I think
Regardless.
I would think we can all agree that no one should be denied the right to vote. Now, state laws, states determine what their laws are when it comes to voting practices.
We are well aware of that.
And but I want to pick up on something you were talking about, and this is more of a way forward as we start to think about taking the audience questions. I'm going to circle back to my question about the difference between fighting for equality, which means everybody has an equal shot, regardless of the outcomes, versus equity, which is preferential treatment for some to, I guess, level the playing field. And let me give you an example of how this is playing out. Maybe you heard about this on the news in Virginia. I believe a school system is considering eliminating math advanced placement classes as a way of leveling the playing field, potentially, and you can do the research for yourself, but potentially because there are not enough students of color, maybe. And we're seeing this trend. I've seen it in Boston, where I attended school growing up. Is that the way forward to achieve equality, by preferential treatment?
No, well, the short answer is no, because we've been trying preferential treatment for more than 40 years now. Affirmative action is not a new thing, and we have some natural experiences, and experiments, I should say, about how it has played out where it's been tried. The University of California system is one example that comes to mind. After voters there in 1996 ended race-based admissions in the University of California system, black graduation rates went up, and not just by a little bit, by more than 50%. So did Hispanic graduation rates. And they also went up, the number of degrees that these kids were earning in the more difficult fields like math and science and engineering also went up after racial preferences had been ended in the system. So a policy that had been put in place to increase the ranks of the black middle class, to expand the number of black professionals, had in practice left us with fewer doctors and lawyers and engineers than we would have had in the absence of the policy. So what was going on? Affirmative action was mismatching children with schools. It was putting kids in schools where they were in over their heads academically, through no fault of their own, but in over their heads academically. And as a result, more of them were dropping out or switching to easier majors. And this is not just true when you break it down by race, it's when you break it down by anything. Anytime you put a student in a school where they don't meet the average academic criteria of the other kids in that school, they're more likely to drop out or switch to easier majors. They're going to struggle. We know this is true among athletes. We know this is true among the children of alumni who get special preferences to get into schools. It's not just a racial thing, but this has been regularly done for black and Hispanic kids for more than 40 years, and it doesn't work. This equity versus equality debate, I think, comes down to another widespread assumption that I take issue with, which is that equal outcomes are the norm. And where we don't see them, racially proportionate outcomes, ethnically proportionate outcomes, gender outcomes, where we don't see proportionate outcomes, something must be wrong. Something is amiss. Something nefarious is going on. No, that should not be the assumption. Equal outcomes are not the norm. They're not the norm here in this country. They're not the norm in other countries. They're not the norm today. They're not the norm 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. The per capita income gap between Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans is larger than the black-white gap in America. And in Europe, you're talking about mostly people of the same race. Every time we see a racial gap in this country, we can't assume racism or racial discrimination is the cause. It is one of many possibilities. But we can't assume that it is the reason, and that should be our laser focus when it comes to getting the proportionalities that we want. I don't think that historically has been the way to go. Mismatching kids with school. There was a study done some years ago of kids at MIT, just to illustrate this mismatch problem. Black students at MIT scored in the top 10%, 90th percentile, on the math section of the SAT among all kids in the country, black or white. Talking about some very bright kids. But among their peers at MIT, they were in the bottom 10%. And therefore, more of them were struggling and dropping out. You were making these kids into artificial failures. Kids that would have been hitting it out of the park at Dean's List kids at University of Michigan, University of Santa Cruz, are struggling at Berkeley and UCLA. For what? What good does it do to flunk out of Duke instead of graduating from the University of Richmond? That is what some of these policies have done. That has been the real world outcome, and I think that is where this equality equity debate goes wrong.
I don't think we've had enough time to measure all of the programs that have been enacted over the last 40 years versus the programs that we've had to deal with and overcome in the last 400 years. I would hope that we would all embrace the notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion as common sense values that can lead to not only strengthening our economy, but making sure that stakeholders have a part of the say in his or own businesses and lives and so forth. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is not about replacing anybody. It's asking someone or asking folks to just move over because there's enough room at the table. Scoot over, make room for others. Give everyone an opportunity to serve and to have a voice. That's what it means.
Not in practice.
It does not mean someone has been kicked out of the room.
Yes, it does, Donna.
No, it does not.
That is why these Asian students at Harvard are suing.
This replacement theory, this notion that somehow or another we're removing people is just ludicrous. It's another way to just, keep this false narrative going. And I firmly disagree.
Well, let me give you the real world example at Harvard. Right now, a bunch of Asian plaintiffs are suing Harvard.
Yes,
They're saying that Harvard admissions officers hold them to higher standards than other groups, that they have to score that much better on the SAT and grade point averages and so forth to be admitted. Essentially, they're only competing with other Asian students to get into Harvard. Harvard denies that it does this, but amazingly, Harvard's Asian admissions have remained remarkably steady over the decades, even as the Asian population of America has grown remarkably. Asians are the fastest growing immigrant group in this country. And we know something is amiss here because at schools that don't use race-based admissions, highly selective schools like Caltech, Asian enrollment at those schools has risen steadily as the Asian population of America has risen steadily. But somehow at Harvard, it's remained remarkably steady for decades. The plaintiffs say this, Donna. Admissions at Harvard is a zero-sum game. There are only so many seats. Discriminating in favor of one group necessarily means discriminating against another group. And that is what is going on. So saying that just move aside and make room, in the real world, that is not how affirmative action policies play out. They amount to reverse discrimination.
And they also amount to tokenism and window dressing when we really don't deal with the systemic causes of why we have corporate boards that are less than, Women can't get on boards. Minorities, women, people of color, Hispanics, blacks. I mean, if I'm not, again, when this notion of scooting over, it's not replacing, it's about making room for everybody. That is what liberty and justice for all means. It doesn't mean that these programs are perfect. I have not found one perfect program. Even the Clean Water Act is not a great program. There are still dirty water and dirty pipes because of when they set the sewer lines. Some people got the pipes that cracked and had the lead put in them, and they had no resources to get those pipes, quote unquote, removed and new ones installed. So we have to work at what I call a more perfect union. It will not come as a result of us critiquing one program that was aimed to open doors, but perhaps some of the people couldn't get in and others found themselves still excluded. Well, I'm not saying it's perfect, Jason. I'm saying that we got to try everything. If we want to rid this country of some of its systemic problems, chronic problems, because all we're doing is recycling this conversation every 2 to 3 years.
Well, what I'm saying is
that's all I'm asking.
There's a difference between saying there aren't opportunities and people not availing themselves of the opportunities or readying themselves to take advantage of the opportunities. And I think in terms of blacks in this country today, the latter is the far bigger problem. And that's why I see limits to the Booker T. Washington debate analogy, W.B. Du Bois debate analogy. I think today we are dealing with a fundamentally different problem, which is not that opportunity doesn't exist, but that enough blacks are not readying themselves to take advantage of the opportunities that do exist. These schools are bending over backwards to get black kids. Companies are bending over backwards to hire black workers. There is a pool problem. You're not supposed to talk about it, but there is a pool problem. And you get at that problem not at the level of when the SAT test is taken. All eliminating the SAT test is going to do. You were talking about the Virginia situation where there's this attack. It's not just the SATs. There's an attack on standardized testing right now for grade schools, for high schools, for colleges. And the move is the test is producing racially disparate outcomes, so let's get rid of the test. All the test is doing is measuring where people are. They're measuring disparities. Getting rid of the test won't get rid of the disparities. Wherever we want black people to go in this country, we need to get there from where we are now. Not where we hope we are or want to pretend we are, but where we are now. The tests are only telling us where we are now. You get rid of the test, you're just obscuring where we are now. These disparities start way before an 18-year-old or 17-year-old sits down to take an SAT test or applies for a clerkship someplace or a job at a bank. There have been studies done on the number of words that children hear before they even get into school, before they even start kindergarten. Studies have shown that, for instance, a child of professional parents will hear about 2,100 words an hour. A child of working class parents will hear about half that, around 1,200 words an hour. And a child of, these are words spoken at home to the child. And a child of parents on welfare will hear about 600 words an hour. And it may not seem like a huge disparity, but what it means is that after a period, the child, a 10-year-old child of parents on welfare, will not have heard as many words as a 3-year-old child of professionals.
And that's regardless of race?
Regardless of race.
Okay, cool.
Regardless of race. The race factor comes in is that the disproportionate number of blacks on welfare. But
there are more whites
disparities,
on welfare.
Disproportionate number of blacks on welfare. But these disparities start at a very young age. And you are not going to correct that when the kid is 17. on the SAT or with a few remedial classes freshman year at MIT. It's not going to work. You have to start addressing these much, much sooner.
So let me pick up on that, because I'm now turning to audience questions and online as well as in the room. This is the first question, and it's perfect. In 1965, and Donna, I'm going to kick this one to you.
Okay.
At the height of the civil rights movement, the Moynihan Report, that might be a familiar term to some folks, the Moynihan Report referenced the rise of single-parent black families as a central issue. It's been 55 plus years, yet no one wants to discuss the far-reaching impact of the destruction of the black family. Why? You can tackle that, but I'd also want you to tackle the role of family and what role that the black family plays today and how it's changed, because when taking it to the social justice movement, there's a redefinition of what the black family looks like.
And you know, again, going back through this, looking at this not just in the last 40 or 50 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, the 65 Voting Rights Act, the 68 Fair Housing Act, the black family has gone through a very unique and a very impossible struggle. The notion that we have so many families that have been torn apart through mass incarceration, through some other problems. There are a lot of insidious problems that the black community, like all other communities, face that we're dealing with. But there's no question that I'm familiar with all of the studies that say, you know, a two-person household and, you know, growing up with, you know, a solid, you know, family structure is important for the success of children in our society. But I want to just stop this notion that somehow or another, you know, black families, I'm going to digress, and so I got to take my emotion out of it. And I take my emotion out of it only because I am proud that my parents were able to, and most of my family, despite all of the hardships and all of the struggles, I can honestly say that the majority of my family, the majority of my siblings, the majority of the people in my life are being raised in a two-person household, even if that second person is a grandma or a grandfather. I want it known that one of the reasons why my parents were successful in getting us through them schools is because we lived in grandma and grandpa's house, and grandma and grandpa also was part of that family structure. So not all nuclear families look like mom and dad, and we ain't coming out of some 1950 TV show. Some of these families look different. Some of these families are struggling. Some of these daddies and some mamas too are in jail for a dime bag. And today it's legal all over. You got more dispensaries here than McDonald's. Damn, I got on the wrong gravy train. My point is that our family, the black family at least, and white families too, have been under enormous pressure and struggle. But yet, the enduring qualities of this family and the social construct is one of survival that comes from the ages, from the generation, when you could not determine if a family could stay together. And so we are fighting to get this family unit strengthened because we know how important that is, not just for the child, but also for society.
Well, this is one of those areas, I'll make 2 points of this. This is another area where we look at racial disparities and jump to the conclusion that racism is responsible for those racial disparities. And this is also an area where there's been retrogression among blacks, and which suggests that something other than racism might be responsible for what's going on. So if you go back to census data, starting in the late 1800s, in every census from 1890 through 1940, black marriage rates in America are higher than white marriage rates in America. as late as the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 black children were being raised in a home with a mother and a father. We've had tremendous retrogression since then. Today, 70 or 80% are not. And in some of our inner cities, it's as high as 80%. No one would argue that there was less racism in the late 1800s and early 1900s than there is in the 1960s or today. We also have this interesting data point. As far back as the mid-90s, married black couples saw a poverty rate in the single digits in this country. For most blacks, or for blacks as a group, I should say, poverty rates average about 3 times the white rate. But among black married couples, poverty rates have been in the single digits. So, are poverty rates we see today among blacks a function of racism or a function of family structure? Too often, we assume it's the former, and then set about trying to correct that. But maybe it has something to do with attitudes towards marriage, attitudes towards child rearing in some of these black communities. That doesn't get the attention it deserves. But it could get us much further to racial parity, like we once had with whites when it came to marriage. And therefore, parity on all kinds of socioeconomic fronts as well.
Donna, would you like to respond, or I can move to another similar
Well,
question?
we'll get another similar question.
Okay. So I talked about the black community not being a monolith, different experiences. I'm an immigrant, and I think when you look at the black community, and this question speaks to this, is that black immigrants have a different experiences compared to those who trace their ancestry to slavery in this country and beyond. So the question, this country has a race issue. Immigrants from the continent of Africa systemically experience the same level of discrimination as those who have ancestral African American heritage, but why are they doing differently? And maybe Jason, have you done any research on this?
Sure. You have to be careful with comparisons between blacks and immigrant groups, including other black immigrants. Immigrants are what economists refer to as self-selecting. And so you're not getting the average person from the country, from the source country. You're getting someone who has already shown they have a certain amount of initiative, can-do spirit coming here. And those people are going to tend to do better, regardless of what color they are or what ethnicity they are. You've had that phenomenon in any number of racial and ethnic minority groups here in America. But it does say something, it does push back a little bit at the all-purpose explanation of racism for racial disparities. In other words, if the employer won't hire blacks because they're black, why are black immigrants able to secure these jobs? If the bank won't lend to blacks because they're blacks, again, why is the black immigrant able to secure these loans? So it is useful in that sense as a sort of pushback against that racial disparities explain racism argument. But you have to be careful in how you. The one point I will make about immigrants, and some people don't like black immigrant comparisons, particularly with European immigrants, and they're not perfect. They're not always apples to apples comparisons, but it doesn't mean we can't learn anything from the experience of other groups, particularly other groups that have been discriminated against and so forth. And so I do think it's useful to go back and look at immigration. But let me just expand on this a little bit. One of the, I think, missteps of the civil rights movement in the 1960s is what happened after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Donna mentioned earlier how she said something like 300 elected officials to 10,000 or something like that. There's been a tremendous explosion in black elected officials in this country. The promoters of the Voting Rights Act thought that black political power was the answer to inequality in this country. If we could just get more of our own in office, the rest will take care of itself. We got this Voting Rights Act, we will just be on cruise control now. And the number of black elected officials exploded in this country. There were fewer than 1,500 in 1970. There are more than 10,000 today. You've had blacks running largely black cities: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. But if you look at the economic progress of blacks in these cities, how did blacks do in Marion Barry's, Washington, D.C.? How did blacks do in Sharp James's, Newark, or Coleman Young's, Detroit? The black poor became worse off. I'm not saying it's because of black politicians or black political leadership. They became worse off under white political leadership too. The point is that political power did not lead to the economic advancement that the civil rights movement thought it would. And I think to some extent they took their eye off the ball, which goes back to the King quote I made earlier about self-development. Integrating political institutions became the priority. And I think what suffered was that focus on black self-development. And there are no shortcuts to that self-development. And the reason I mention this in connection with the question about immigration is because one of the groups that blacks in this regard seem to have modeled themselves on are the Irish. The Irish that came in the 1800s, the middle 1800s, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s were tremendously successful politically. You had Irish-run political machines in your Philadelphias and your New Yorks. But the Irish poor during this period were not doing well. There was no real Irish middle class to speak of. It wasn't really until the decline of these political machines that you saw the rise of the Irish middle class in America, to the point where today the Irish are above average in home ownership and earnings and educational achievement and all the rest. And my point here is that political power can get you there eventually. It's just been proven by history and the history of other groups to be a much slower route than pursuing economic power first. If you look at the group that is hitting it out of the park today, economically, academically, and so forth, it's probably Asian Americans. How much political power do Asian Americans have in this country? Who are your Asian American leaders that have been necessary to pull the Asians up from poverty? So again, different groups have followed different paths. There aren't perfect apples-to-apples comparisons, but we can learn something from the experience of other racial and ethnic groups in this country.
I agree with only 1 or 2 points from Jason, and that is blacks have modeled some of their political power on what I often would refer to what I call boss politics. Okay? I mean, for those of us who've had to come through the political world, and I've had to come through it, boss politics. I mean, if the boss thought you were good enough to be the secretary in the party, you were the secretary. If the boss thought you were good enough to run for office, you ran for office. If the boss thought that you would treat the community that you came from with respect, you got their back and you got their money. That's why less than 4% of the American people have run for office. 4%. Pew study. So I recognize that, but Dr. King started talking about the ballot as part of the struggle that the community needed back in the 1957. Remember, the Montgomery bus boycott started right after Rosa Parks sat down in December of 55. So by 1957, Dr. King gave a great sermon on give us the ballot. so that we can fill the halls of state legislatures and city councils and town halls and Congress with people who would also represent and be the change makers. So he saw political activism as a part of civil rights, as part of giving back to your country, as part of your civic engagement. And I don't believe, as someone who started knocking on doors at the age of 9 to get a candidate elected to build a playground in our community, we had no playground. There were no playgrounds on the side of the tracks I grew up. On the side of the tracks, most black kids. And so we advanced that cause through our political participation, and getting people to register to vote was explaining to them that as taxpayers, you want to have a say in what's happening in your community. You know, I live in Washington, D.C. I got 5G on my neighborhood. Take out my cell phone, I have 5G. I've been zooming. I am so zoomed out, I can't even explain it. But as I leave my house and drive down 16th Street in the direction of the White House over to the Capitol, I still have 5G, or at least 4 bars. By the time I leave the United States Capitol, which is about 5.9 miles from my house, and I go toward the Anacostia River, I have 1 bar and it's LTE. Now, maybe that is a function of, quote unquote, the capitalistic system of which I'm a part of, right? Maybe that is a function. We're going to the people who are using our services, yet you will find, study after study, that more black people are using broadband, using this technology, and yet they don't have access to the same kind of broadband that I have and those who live in the quote-unquote smaller part of Washington, D.C., what I call the inner heart of D.C. I live off of 16th Street, 3.3 miles from the White House. I calculated when Obama got in the White House, just in case I had to run down. And when Trump got in there, when I had to run away. Although I knew him more than I knew Barack Obama, which is another thing. My point is that civil rights is human rights, and we should all have access to 5G. We should all have access to the kind of internet and broadband. We can't ask our students to excel at a time when they're being told that they can't go to school and they have no access. They have to go sit in the car or go sit outside of a Starbucks or a McDonald's just to connect. And I have all things on cylinder in my house. I even learned some other tools. But that is what civil rights and equality means, is giving everyone access. The taxpayers pay for it, the companies pay for it. We are taxpayers. We all pay for it. The customers, of course they do. But these customers are also majority black and brown with these devices. I'm not just talking about the big devices, I'm talking about these small ones too.
So, can you believe the time has gone by already?
No.
I think everybody wants to continue, but maybe we'll have to do this again. What do you think, Donna and Jason?
Look, I'll hang out with Jason any day.
Well, why don't
I
we...
learned so much from his brilliance. We're on Sunday shows, but I learned so much. And while I don't have every stat in my head about who's getting in and who's not getting in college, I'm so glad LSU took me. And as I often say, my body got me in the college, my brains got me out because I was an athlete and I had a partial scholarship, and so I was able to go away a few miles to LSU, the state, the state big university. But I want to just say thank you all. These are tough conversations, but these are conversations we should have. As Americans, we should be able to have this dialogue. We should be able to put these issues on the table and not just demonize someone simply because they may look different or they may even sound different, but to learn from them. You know, when I decided, and I'll close, I know because Patrice is a stickler for time. When I decided that I wanted to be a part of the Fox News Network, you know what I decided? I wanted to hear from the other side. Now, I don't believe that everyone on Fox speaks for conservative or speaks for different, parts of our country, but I believe that I wanted to hear them. I have no problem sitting next to somebody from whom I disagree as long as I can learn from him or her. And we need to have these conversations so that we can learn how to make this a more perfect union. So thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, the Benson Institute, Betty. Thank you all for having us. Thank you, University of Colorado, Boulder. And God bless you all.
Jason, some final thoughts.
I just wanted to briefly echo everything Donna just said. Just that last part that she said. Nothing, just that. And also, again, thank the Benson Center and the Steamboat Institute. I do a fair amount of speaking on college campuses, and I don't take these invitations for granted anymore. I don't think you can, given the environment on campus these days when it comes to tolerating different points of view. Some of you may know the University of Chicago a few years ago began sending out letters to incoming freshmen telling them that they don't go for safe spaces and trigger warnings and don't cancel invited speakers because they might say something controversial. That used to be understood on college campuses. Now it needs to be stated specifically in writing to incoming freshmen, which I think tells you where we are today. So again, I think college should be a place where you sharpen your critical thinking skills and expose yourself to other points of view and learn the difference between a slogan and an argument and grapple with ideas and people you disagree with, not just try and silence them, which seems to be the modus operandi on a lot of campuses these days. And not only among the students, but with the support of an increasing number of faculty and administrators, I might add. So thank you again for doing this. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, as Jennifer comes up, please feel free to take the poll question one more time. I want to know if your perception in answer to the question has changed, but thank you so much for hosting us, and hopefully we'll be doing this again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Yes. I know from earlier it was at the start. So the question was, is the social justice movement of today the same as the civil rights movement of 1950 to 60? And 83% of you resoundingly said no. Only 4% of you said yes, and a few were undecided. Let me see if I can pull this up very quickly for you. Of course, technology doesn't work when you need it to. Okay.
No 5G.
No 5G.
She's looking to see if the results changed later.
Exactly.
See if after
No
Post
5G
okay.
here either, but I have 4 bars.
All right, this is interesting, folks. So is the social justice movement of today the same as the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s? Now, 92% of you say no. So some minds were changed from 82% to 92%. Thank you, everyone.
Well, once again, this is one that maybe we should have had it go 2 hours because it was that good. Jason, Donna, Patrice, let's hear it for our panelists.